The funny thing about being invisible is that people eventually start believing you are. I learned that lesson 3 years ago, on my first day working at the Sterling estate, and every day after that only proved it true. My name is Grace Parker. I was 26 years old, lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of Boston with my grandmother, and spent most mornings polishing floors that cost more than my annual salary. The Sterling mansion sat on a hill overlooking the harbor, all glass, stone, and perfection. Tourists stopped outside the gates just to take pictures. Business magazines called it a symbol of success. To me, it was simply where I worked 6 days a week. Every morning at 5:30, I tied my hair back, slipped into my uniform, and started cleaning before the sun climbed above the water. The house woke slowly. Chefs arrived first. Then assistants. Then security. Finally, somewhere around 8, the owner of the estate would appear. Ethan Sterling. Billionaire. Founder. CEO. The kind of man whose face showed up on magazine covers in airport bookstores. People talked about him like he was larger than life. Smarter than everyone else. Untouchable. I had worked in his house for nearly 8 months and he had never once asked my name. Not because he was cruel. Not because he was arrogant. Simply because people like me blended into the background. We opened doors. We cleaned windows. We disappeared before anyone noticed we were there. That morning felt no different. Rain tapped softly against the massive kitchen windows while I carried a basket of fresh towels upstairs. The scent of expensive coffee drifted through the hallways. Somewhere in the distance, a piano recording played through hidden speakers. Everything about the mansion was designed to feel calm. Perfect. Controlled. I was replacing linens in one of the guest suites when voices drifted through the partially open door. 2 executives were speaking quietly in the hallway. They didn't know I was there. Most people never did. "He hasn't slept in days," one of them said. "The board meeting is tomorrow." The other sighed. "He'll be fine. Ethan always finds a way." Their footsteps faded. I finished making the bed and stared out the window for a moment. Below, the ocean looked gray beneath the storm clouds. I thought about my grandmother waiting at home. About the stack of medical bills hidden in my kitchen drawer. About the second job I would work after leaving the estate that evening. Then I picked up my cleaning supplies and kept moving. That's what people like me did. We kept moving. We kept working. We kept surviving. By noon, the mansion buzzed with activity. Assistants hurried through corridors carrying tablets and folders. Security teams checked entrances. The entire house seemed to orbit around one man. Yet when Ethan Sterling finally walked past me near the west staircase, something felt different. His shoulders looked heavier somehow. His expression tighter. There were shadows beneath his eyes that even wealth couldn't hide. He never looked my way. He never slowed down. But for the first time, I found myself watching him disappear around the corner, unaware that before the next sunrise, both of our lives would change forever. The rain had not stopped by the time my shift ended. Tiny droplets clung to the mansion windows like silver beads, turning the harbor lights into blurry streaks of gold and white. Most of the staff had already gone home, but I stayed behind to finish folding laundry in the service wing. Overtime was never guaranteed, and every extra dollar mattered. My grandmother's prescription refill was due next week. The clock on the wall read 1:47 in the morning when I finally pushed my cart into the hallway. The estate felt different at night. Quieter. Bigger somehow. The polished corridors stretched endlessly beneath soft recessed lights. Every sound seemed louder. The wheels of my cart. My footsteps. The distant hum of the climate control system. I was halfway toward the employee entrance when I noticed something unusual. A light was still on beneath the door of Ethan Sterling's private office. That alone was not surprising. Everyone knew he worked longer hours than anyone else in the company. What caught my attention was the silence. No phone calls. No conversations. No movement. Just stillness. I told myself to keep walking. His schedule was none of my business. Neither was his office. But something in my stomach tightened as I passed the door. Maybe it was the memory of those executives talking earlier. Maybe it was the exhaustion I had seen in his face. Maybe it was simple instinct. Whatever it was, it made me stop. For several seconds I stood there staring at the narrow line of light beneath the door. Then I knocked softly. No answer. I waited. Still nothing. My pulse quickened. I knocked again, louder this time. Silence. A strange feeling crept over me. The kind that tells you something is wrong before your mind can explain why. Carefully, I turned the handle. The door opened a few inches. The office beyond was illuminated by the glow of computer screens and city lights reflecting through floor-to-ceiling windows. Papers covered the massive desk. Empty coffee cups sat beside a stack of reports. And Ethan Sterling was slumped forward in his chair. For one terrifying second, my mind went completely blank. Then training took over. Years earlier I had completed a workplace emergency certification course. Most people forgot what they learned after a few months. I had not. I rushed across the room. "Mr. Sterling?" I said. No response. My heart hammered against my ribs. "Ethan?" Still nothing. His skin looked pale beneath the office lights. His breathing was shallow and uneven. I immediately reached for the phone on his desk and called emergency services. My voice shook as I explained the situation. The operator remained calm, guiding me through each step while help was dispatched. Minutes felt like hours. I stayed beside him the entire time, speaking softly even though I did not know whether he could hear me. Outside, rain tapped against the glass. Inside, the clock on the wall seemed impossibly loud. Finally, distant footsteps echoed through the hallway as security and medical personnel arrived. Relief hit me so hard my knees nearly gave out. The room suddenly filled with activity. Questions. Equipment. Movement. Yet amid all the commotion, I noticed something unexpected. As they carefully assisted him, Ethan's eyes opened for the briefest moment. Only a second. Maybe less. But in that second, those tired blue eyes met mine for the very first time. And before exhaustion pulled him back under, he looked at me as though he was trying to remember my face. When I returned to work 2 days later, I expected everything to feel normal again. I expected to disappear back into the background where I belonged. Instead, the moment I stepped through the employee entrance, people were looking at me differently. Not dramatically. Not openly. Just enough to make me uncomfortable. Conversations paused when I walked into rooms. A few staff members smiled at me in ways they never had before. One even thanked me for what I had done. I did not know how to respond because I still did not feel like I had done anything extraordinary. I had seen someone who needed help and called for it. That was all. By lunchtime, the estate had settled back into its usual rhythm. Deliveries arrived. Meetings came and went. Assistants hurried through hallways carrying schedules and reports. I spent most of the day organizing storage rooms and replacing linens on the second floor. The familiarity of routine helped calm my nerves. Then, just after 3 o'clock, the head housekeeper approached me carrying a sealed envelope. "This came from Mr. Sterling's office," she said. My stomach tightened immediately. "For me?" She nodded. "Personally addressed." After she walked away, I stared at the envelope for several seconds before carefully opening it. Inside was a simple card and a certified check. The amount printed on it made my breath catch. It was more money than I earned in several months. For a moment, I simply stood there frozen. The number seemed unreal. My grandmother's medical bills flashed through my mind. The overdue repairs on our apartment. The constant pressure that followed me every day. One check could solve so many problems. My hands trembled slightly as I read the note attached beneath it. Grace. Thank you for your actions that evening. Please accept this as a gesture of appreciation. Ethan Sterling. That was it. Short. Professional. Polite. Yet something about it made my chest feel unexpectedly heavy. I looked down at the check again. Then back at the note. Then down once more. Most people would have accepted it without hesitation. Maybe they would have been right to. But the longer I stared at the paper, the more uncomfortable I felt. I had not helped him for money. I had not even known him. If the situation had involved a gardener, a driver, or a complete stranger on the street, I would have done exactly the same thing. By the end of my shift, I had made my decision. The executive offices occupied the top floor of the East Wing. Employees rarely had reasons to go there. The hallways were quieter. The furniture more expensive. The air itself seemed different somehow. I held the envelope tightly as I approached the assistant outside Ethan's office. May I leave this for him? I asked. She looked surprised but accepted it. I turned to leave before she could ask questions. Grace. The sound of my name stopped me instantly. I looked over my shoulder. Ethan Sterling stood several feet away near the conference room entrance. He looked healthier than he had that night, though the exhaustion had not completely left his eyes. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then his gaze shifted toward the envelope in his assistant's hands. You are returning it? He asked quietly. I swallowed. Yes, sir. His expression revealed nothing. Why? I took a slow breath. Because helping someone should not come with a price tag. The silence that followed felt strangely important. And for the second time in my life, Ethan Sterling looked directly at me as though he was seeing me for the very first time. For the rest of that afternoon, I could not stop thinking about the way he had looked at me. Not because he was famous. Not because he was wealthy. But because it felt strange to finally be noticed after spending so much of my life blending into the background. The next morning, I arrived at the estate before sunrise. A cool breeze drifted in from the harbor, carrying the scent of salt water through the gardens. Everything looked exactly the same. The stone pathways. The perfectly trimmed hedges. The fountain near the entrance reflecting the first pale light of dawn. Yet something felt different. Or maybe it was just me. I spent the morning preparing guest rooms for an upcoming corporate retreat. Around 10 o'clock, I was carrying fresh towels through the east corridor when I noticed one of the maintenance workers struggling with a large supply cart. One wheel had jammed against the edge of a rug. Here, let me help, I said. Together we maneuvered the cart free. He smiled gratefully. Thanks, Grace. Anytime. Small moments like that happened all day. I helped one of the kitchen assistants organize a shipment that arrived late. I covered for a housekeeper whose daughter had become sick at school. I spent my lunch break helping an elderly groundskeeper figure out how to submit paperwork through the new employee system. None of it felt important. It was simply how I had been raised. My grandmother always said that kindness costs nothing but often means everything. By late afternoon, dark clouds gathered over the harbor again. I was dusting shelves in one of the library rooms when voices drifted through the partially open doorway. Several executives were meeting nearby. The investors are pushing harder than ever, one man said. He has not taken a real day off in years. Another laughed softly. Try telling Ethan that. He would probably schedule a meeting about it. Their conversation faded as they walked away. A few minutes later, I stepped into the hallway carrying a box of old records. As I rounded the corner, I nearly collided with someone. I stopped abruptly. Ethan Sterling stood directly in front of me. Sorry, I said immediately. That was my fault. No, he replied. I was not paying attention. For a second, neither of us moved. Then his eyes shifted toward the heavy box in my arms. That looks heavier than it should be. I glanced down. It is mostly paperwork. Without another word, he reached for the box. I can carry it. My first instinct was to refuse. He was the owner of the estate. I was an employee. The situation felt completely backward. Yet before I could protest, he had already taken the box. We walked down the hallway together in silence. Several staff members stared openly as we passed. I pretended not to notice. When we reached the storage room, he carefully set the box down. Thank you, I said. He nodded once. Then his gaze lingered for a moment. Thoughtful. Curious. Almost puzzled. As though he was trying to solve a mystery he did not fully understand. Finally, he spoke. Everyone here seems to like you, Grace. I shrugged. I tried to be kind. His expression softened slightly. That is rarer than you think. And as he walked away, I found myself wondering why a man who seemed to have everything sounded unexpectedly lonely. The first hospital bill arrived on a Thursday. I found it folded between advertisements and utility statements when I checked the mailbox after work. The envelope looked ordinary. Plain white paper. Black print. Nothing dramatic. Yet the moment I saw the logo in the corner, my chest tightened. By the time I climbed the 3 flights of stairs to our apartment, my hands were already shaking. My grandmother sat in her favorite chair near the window, a knitted blanket resting across her knees. Evening sunlight painted soft golden lines across the room. She smiled the moment she saw me. Long day? She asked. The usual, I replied, forcing a smile of my own. I slipped the envelope into my bag before she could notice it. That night, after she went to bed, I opened it alone at the kitchen table. The number printed at the bottom seemed impossible. I read it 3 times. Then a 4th. The specialist appointments. The medications. The cardiac monitoring. Insurance had covered some of it. Not enough. I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers against my forehead. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows. Inside, the refrigerator hummed quietly in the darkness. I had been working 2 jobs for almost a year. Every dollar already had a destination before I earned it. Rent. Groceries. Prescriptions. Utilities. There was never anything left. I folded the bill carefully and placed it inside a kitchen drawer beneath old receipts where my grandmother would never find it. The next morning, I arrived at the estate exhausted. The lack of sleep sat behind my eyes like a headache waiting to happen. I moved through my duties automatically, trying to ignore the numbers repeating endlessly inside my head. Around noon, I stepped outside for a quick break. The harbor wind felt colder than usual. I sat alone on a stone bench overlooking the water and opened my lunch. Half a sandwich. An apple. Nothing fancy. Just enough to get through the day. You look worried. The voice startled me. I looked up. Ethan stood a few feet away, holding a coffee cup. I immediately straightened. Sorry, I did not see you there. Clearly. The corner of his mouth twitched slightly. Not quite a smile. Close. His eyes studied me for a moment. Is everything okay? Most people ask that question out of politeness. They expect a simple answer. Fine. Great. No problem. Something about the way he asked made it harder to lie. Just tired, I said quietly. He seemed unconvinced. The silence stretched between us. Harbor waves rolled gently against the rocks below. Finally, he nodded. Make sure you take care of yourself too, Grace. Such a simple sentence. Yet it stayed with me long after he walked away. Because I could not remember the last time anyone had said those words to me. That evening, as I returned to work inside the mansion, I did not notice the folded hospital statement slipping from my bag when I reached for my keys. I did not notice it drifting onto the polished marble floor behind me. And I certainly did not notice who picked it up a few minutes later. The next morning began like any other. The harbor was covered in a thin layer of fog, and the mansion seemed to float above the water like something out of a dream. I arrived early, hoping work would distract me from the constant worry sitting in my chest. For the first few hours, it almost worked. I cleaned guest rooms, organized supplies, and helped prepare the dining hall for a private luncheon. Then shortly after noon, everything changed. One of the guests arrived with his son, a man named Trevor Whitmore whose family owned several luxury developments along the coast. I had seen him around the estate before. Loud. Entitled. The type of person who treated employees like furniture. I was carrying a tray of fresh coffee into one of the meeting rooms when he stepped directly into my path. "You nearly spilled that," he said sharply. I stopped. "I am sorry, sir." Sorry does not fix expensive suits. Several people around the table laughed politely. I lowered my eyes and continued toward the serving station. Encounters like that were not unusual. Most of the time I ignored them. But throughout the afternoon, Trevor seemed determined to make my job difficult. He complained about things that were not wrong. Sent me back for items he never requested. Corrected details that did not need correcting. By 3 o'clock, my patience was wearing thin. Still, I remained polite. That was part of the job. The final incident happened near the West Terrace. I was arranging refreshments for the closing reception when Trevor approached again. "You forgot the imported sparkling water." I checked the table. The bottles were exactly where they were supposed to be. "It is right here, sir." His expression darkened. "Are you arguing with me?" Several nearby guests turned toward us. Heat rose into my face. "No, sir. I was only trying to help." "Then learn to do your job properly." The words were not loud, but they carried far enough for everyone to hear. Embarrassment settled heavily in my stomach. I opened my mouth to apologize even though I had done nothing wrong. Before I could speak, another voice interrupted. "She is doing her job properly." The entire terrace went silent. I turned slowly. Ethan stood near the entrance, one hand resting in his pocket. His expression was calm, but there was an unmistakable firmness in his voice. Trevor laughed awkwardly. "I was simply offering feedback." "No," Ethan replied. "You were creating a problem where none existed." The silence deepened. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Ethan's gaze shifted briefly toward me before returning to Trevor. "Grace is one of the most reliable employees on this property. If there is an issue with the service today, it is certainly not hers." I could hardly breathe. Nobody had ever defended me like that before. Not publicly. Not without being asked. Trevor forced a smile and muttered something about a misunderstanding before walking away. Conversation slowly resumed around us. The moment passed. Yet something inside me felt different. Ethan looked at me for a second longer. Then he said quietly, "You do not need to apologize for things that are not your fault, Grace." And as he walked away, I realized he had already broken one of the unwritten rules that governed people like him. Powerful people rarely noticed the invisible. Powerful people almost never stood beside them. After that afternoon, something subtle began to change. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. Ethan seemed to appear everywhere. At first I assumed it was coincidence. The estate was large, but his schedule often took him through different parts of the property. Still, I started seeing him more often than before. One morning I was helping the kitchen staff unload fresh produce when he walked through the service entrance instead of using the main hallway. Another day I was organizing supplies in the West Wing when he suddenly appeared asking questions about storage renovations that had apparently never interested him before. Each interaction was brief. Polite. Ordinary. Yet they happened often enough that even I began to wonder. A week later, I was replacing flowers in the library when one of the younger assistants approached me. "What did you do?" she asked. I blinked. What do you mean? She lowered her voice. The boss keeps asking about you. My stomach dropped. He does not. He does. She smiled knowingly. Yesterday he asked whether your grandmother was feeling better. I nearly dropped the vase in my hands. I had never told Ethan about my grandmother. Not directly. Then I remembered the hospital bill. The paper he had probably found after I lost it. Heat rushed into my cheeks. The assistant laughed softly before walking away. For the rest of the day, I tried not to think about it. Unfortunately, thinking about it became impossible. That evening, I finished work later than usual and stopped at a small grocery store on the way home. By the time I reached our apartment building, darkness had settled over the city. My grandmother was asleep in her chair when I arrived. I carefully covered her with a blanket and carried the groceries into the kitchen. That was when I noticed something unusual on the table. A cardboard box sat beside the fruit bowl. No return address. No note. Just a shipping label with my name. Confused, I opened it. Inside were several specialty nutrition supplements recommended by my grandmother's cardiologist. The expensive kind. The kind I always skipped because they cost too much. Beneath them sat a sealed envelope. My pulse quickened as I opened it. The note contained only one sentence. For someone who takes care of everyone else, remember to take care of yourself too. There was no signature. There did not need to be. I sat at the kitchen table staring at those words for a very long time. Outside, traffic moved through the streets below. Somewhere in the distance, a siren echoed briefly before fading away. The apartment felt unusually quiet. My grandmother stirred softly in her sleep. I looked at the supplements. Then at the note. Then back again. For years, life had been simple. Difficult, but simple. Work hard. Pay bills. Keep moving forward. Nobody noticed. Nobody asked questions. Nobody looked closely enough to care. Yet somehow Ethan Sterling had started paying attention. And what frightened me most was not the possibility that he cared. It was the realization that I had started looking for him too. The trouble started on a Monday. Looking back, I should have recognized the signs earlier. The whispered conversations that stopped when I entered a room. The sudden coldness from people who had always been polite. The strange looks that followed me through the hallways. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. The estate employed dozens of people. Everyone had stressful days. Not every silence was about me. Not every glance carried meaning. But by Wednesday, even I could not ignore it anymore. I was restocking supplies in the housekeeping office when I walked in on two employees speaking quietly near the filing cabinets. The moment they saw me, they fell silent. One of them looked away immediately. The other offered an awkward smile before leaving the room. A knot formed in my stomach. Something was wrong. I just did not know what. That afternoon, I found myself called into the office of Margaret Reynolds, the estate's operations manager. Margaret had worked for the Sterling family for nearly 20 years. She controlled everything from staffing schedules to purchasing approvals. Most employees respected her. Many feared her. I sat across from her desk while she reviewed several documents. Her expression remained unreadable. "Grace," she said finally, "have you noticed anything unusual recently?" The question caught me off guard. "I am not sure what you mean." She folded her hands together. "Missing inventory. Discrepancies in supply records. Certain items have disappeared over the last month." My heart skipped. "I do not know anything about that." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "I hope not." The meeting ended a few minutes later, but the uneasiness stayed with me. That evening, rain drummed against the mansion windows while I finished cleaning the executive conference rooms. Outside, the harbor disappeared beneath sheets of gray mist. Inside, the estate felt colder than usual. As I passed through the service corridor, I noticed several employees staring at me again. One quickly looked away. Another whispered something I could not hear. My pulse quickened. The next morning, the situation became impossible to ignore. When I arrived for work, my employee access badge failed at the security entrance. I tried again. Nothing. The guard looked uncomfortable. "You need to speak with management." The words landed like ice water. Within minutes, I found myself standing inside Margaret's office again. This time 2 human resources representatives were present. Several folders sat on the desk between us. The room felt suddenly too small. "Grace," Margaret began carefully, "an internal review has identified serious concerns regarding missing inventory and unauthorized purchases." I stared at her. "What does that have to do with me?" She slid a folder across the desk. "Your employee credentials were used to approve several transactions." My hands trembled as I opened it. Purchase orders. Supply requests. Electronic approvals. My name appeared everywhere. Except I had never signed any of them. "This is not possible," I whispered. "I did not do this." No one answered immediately. Outside the office window, rain streaked down the glass. Inside, silence settled heavily around me. Then Margaret spoke the words that changed everything. "Until the investigation is completed, you are being suspended from your position." And in that moment, I realized someone inside the estate did not just want me gone. They had been planning it for a long time. For a long moment, I simply sat there staring at the documents spread across the desk. My name appeared on every page. My employee identification number. My authorization code. My digital signature. It looked convincing. Too convincing. Almost as if someone had spent weeks making sure every detail appeared authentic. "I did not do this," I said again. My voice sounded smaller than I intended. Margaret sighed quietly. "Grace, this is not a final decision. It is a suspension while we investigate." I looked around the room. None of them could meet my eyes. That hurt more than I expected. For years I had arrived before sunrise. Worked weekends. Covered extra shifts. Helped whenever anyone asked. Yet all it took was a few papers for people to question everything. I wanted to argue. To demand answers. To fight for myself. Instead, I slowly stood. "I understand." One of the human resources representatives blinked in surprise. "You do?" I nodded. "If the evidence looks like this, I understand why you have concerns." Margaret looked genuinely uncomfortable now. "Grace." I offered a small smile. "I know who I am. Eventually the truth will matter." No one spoke after that. The rain continued tapping softly against the windows as I collected my bag and employee badge. The walk through the mansion felt longer than it ever had before. Every hallway carried memories. Every room reminded me of the life I had built there. I passed the library where Ethan had helped carry a box. The terrace where he had defended me. The kitchen where staff shared birthday cakes and holiday meals. It felt strange knowing I might never return. Several employees watched me leave. Some looked sympathetic. Others avoided eye contact entirely. I did not blame them. People become cautious when trouble appears. They step back. They protect themselves. By the time I reached the front entrance, the storm outside had intensified. Gray clouds covered the harbor. Wind rattled the trees lining the driveway. I stepped beneath the covered entrance and paused. A black sedan pulled into the circular drive. My heart sank immediately. Ethan emerged from the back seat while speaking on his phone. For one dangerous second, I considered waiting. Explaining everything. Telling him the accusations were false. But something inside me refused. If he believed in me, the truth would find him eventually. If he did not, no explanation would change anything. So I turned away before he could see me. I walked down the long driveway carrying everything I owned from my locker in a single cardboard box. Family photos. A coffee mug. A spare sweater. Small pieces of a life that no longer existed. The rain soaked through my jacket within minutes. Still, I kept walking. By the time I reached the bus stop, my phone buzzed repeatedly inside my pocket. 3 missed calls from unknown numbers. 1 voicemail. Then another call. I ignored them all. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table while my grandmother slept nearby. The apartment felt quieter than ever. The cardboard box rested beside my chair. Unemployment forms and medical bills lay scattered across the table. The future suddenly looked frighteningly uncertain. Yet beneath the fear, another feeling remained. Pride. Because despite everything, I had not begged. I had not pleaded. I had walked away with the only thing nobody could take from me. My dignity. What I did not know was that back at the estate, Ethan Sterling had just finished a 14-hour meeting. And the first question he asked when he noticed my absence would change everything. The next morning, I woke up before dawn out of habit. For several seconds, I forgot everything. Then reality returned all at once. The estate. The suspension. The accusations. The uncertainty waiting on the other side of the day. I quietly prepared breakfast for my grandmother and spent the morning searching through job listings that all seemed to require experience I did not have or schedules that would make caring for her impossible. By noon, frustration had settled heavily across my shoulders. Meanwhile, nearly 20 miles away, Ethan Sterling was asking questions. It started the moment he arrived at the estate and noticed I was missing. At first, he assumed I had taken a day off. Then another. Then he asked one of the housekeepers where I was. The uncomfortable silence that followed immediately caught his attention. By the end of the hour, he was sitting across from Margaret Reynolds in her office reviewing the investigation file. According to the reports, inventory discrepancies had been traced back to employee credentials assigned to me. Purchase approvals carried my authorization. Supply records appeared to connect me directly to the missing items. On paper, the case looked complete. Too complete. Ethan flipped through every page without speaking. Margaret finally broke the silence. The evidence was substantial enough that Human Resources recommended immediate suspension. Ethan nodded once. Did Grace admit responsibility? No. Did she attempt to defend herself? Margaret hesitated. Not really. That answer seemed to bother him more than anything else. He leaned back in his chair and stared through the office window. He remembered the woman who had refused a check worth several months of salary. The woman who spent her lunch breaks helping coworkers. The woman who quietly carried hospital bills while worrying more about others than herself. None of it matched. Hours later, after everyone else had gone home, Ethan remained alone in his office reviewing records. Rain tapped softly against the glass while computer screens illuminated the dark room. Something continued bothering him. Not the accusations themselves. The timing. The precision. The way every document seemed perfectly organized. He requested access logs from the estate's internal systems. Then security footage. Then purchasing records dating back 6 months. What began as curiosity slowly turned into concern. Shortly before midnight, he found the first inconsistency. One approval linked to my credentials had been submitted while I was physically clocked into a different building on the opposite side of the property. A second transaction occurred during hours when I was not even scheduled to work. Ethan stared at the screen for several seconds. Then he opened another file. And another. Patterns began emerging. Small details. Tiny mistakes. The kind people overlook when they believe nobody will look closely enough. By 1 in the morning, concern had become certainty. Someone had manipulated the records. Someone inside the estate had deliberately built a case against me. Ethan rose from his desk and walked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the harbor. The city lights shimmered across the dark water below. For the first time in years, a business problem felt personal. Because this was no longer about missing inventory. It was about Grace. And somewhere inside that realization was a truth he had been trying very hard not to face. The following 48 hours changed the entire estate. While I spent my days filling out job applications and pretending not to worry in front of my grandmother, Ethan Sterling was quietly pulling apart the investigation piece by piece. The deeper he looked, the worse the truth became. Every trail eventually pointed toward people he trusted. Senior employees. Longtime managers. Individuals whose reputations had never been questioned. By Friday morning, he had assembled enough evidence to call an emergency executive meeting. The atmosphere inside the conference room was tense from the moment everyone arrived. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the harbor, but nobody paid attention to the view. Ethan sat at the head of the table, silent as the final attendees took their seats. Margaret Reynolds sat near the center. Several department heads exchanged nervous glances. No one knew why the meeting had been called. Ethan opened a folder and slid copies of several documents across the table. I spent the last 2 days reviewing the internal investigation. Silence followed. There were errors. One executive shifted uncomfortably. Another reached for the paperwork. Ethan's voice remained calm. Not small errors. Deliberate ones. He proceeded to explain everything. Access logs that had been altered. Approval records that did not match employee schedules. Security footage that contradicted official reports. Every new fact made the room quieter. Faces slowly lost color. Confidence turned into discomfort. Discomfort turned into fear. Margaret stared at the documents in front of her. You are saying someone manipulated the investigation? I am saying someone targeted an innocent employee. Nobody argued. Because the evidence no longer allowed it. Ethan stood and walked toward the windows. His reflection appeared against the gray harbor beyond the glass. Grace Parker devoted years to this estate. While the rest of us focused on profits, meetings, and quarterly reports, she was helping people. He turned back toward the room. And when she was falsely accused, almost nobody questioned it. The words landed harder than anyone expected. Several executives lowered their eyes. Others avoided looking at him entirely. Ethan rarely spoke emotionally during business meetings. That alone made the moment unforgettable. Then came the decision. Effective immediately, multiple managers involved in the failed investigation were removed from their positions pending further review. Several senior employees lost authority they had spent years building. The announcement sent shockwaves through the organization. There would be backlash. Questions from investors. Complaints from board members. Public scrutiny if the situation became known outside the company. Ethan understood all of it. He made the decision anyway. Later that evening, long after the meeting ended, he remained alone in his office overlooking the harbor. Rain drifted softly across the windows. City lights shimmered in the darkness below. On his desk sat a photograph taken during a company holiday event months earlier. Most people would have overlooked it. Ethan had not. Near the edge of the image stood a young woman helping an elderly employee adjust a winter coat before stepping out into the snow. She had not known anyone was taking a picture. She had not been seeking attention. She was simply being herself. Ethan stared at the photograph for a long time. Then he picked up his phone. Because there was still one thing left to do. He needed to find Grace Parker and tell her the truth. 3 days passed before I heard from Ethan Sterling. By then, I had convinced myself that chapter of my life was over. I spent my mornings searching for work and my evenings helping my grandmother around the apartment. The uncertainty never disappeared, but I learned how to carry it. That Saturday afternoon, I was returning from the pharmacy when a black car pulled quietly to the curb outside our building. I barely noticed it at first. Cars came and went all the time. Then the rear door opened. My footsteps slowed. Ethan stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a dark overcoat, the harbor wind tugging gently at the fabric. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city moved around us. Traffic lights changed. Pedestrians passed by. Yet everything seemed strangely distant. "Grace," he said. Hearing my name in his voice felt unfamiliar now. "What are you doing here?" I asked softly. He looked directly at me. "Fixing a mistake." Those 3 words immediately told me everything. My heart began beating faster. Ethan reached into his coat and handed me a folder. Inside were investigation reports, audit findings, security reviews, and signed statements. Page after page proved what I had known all along. I had been innocent. Someone else had manipulated the records. Someone else had built the case against me. I stared at the documents until the words blurred. Relief arrived first. Then anger. Then exhaustion. Months of stress seemed to leave my body all at once. "I am sorry," Ethan said quietly. I looked up. "You did not do it." "No." His expression tightened. "But I should have stopped it sooner." The honesty surprised me. Powerful people rarely admitted fault. They explained. Deflected. Justified. Ethan did none of those things. We walked slowly toward a small park across the street. Autumn leaves drifted through the air while children played near a fountain. For the first time, he told me things I had never known. About the pressure of leading a company that employed thousands of people. About years spent chasing success while convincing himself work mattered more than everything else. About how easy it had become to overlook individuals while focusing on numbers. "Then I met you," he said. I looked away immediately. The words felt too personal. Too dangerous. Ethan continued anyway. "You helped people when nobody was watching. You expected nothing in return. Do you know how rare that is?" I smiled faintly. My grandmother would say it should not be rare at all. A quiet laugh escaped him. Then his expression became serious again. "The board is furious." I frowned. "Why?" "Because I removed senior managers. Because investors are asking questions. Because correcting what happened has been expensive." I stared at him. "You did all of that?" He nodded once. "Some things matter more than convenience." The wind carried fallen leaves across the path between us. Neither of us moved. Finally, Ethan reached into his coat one last time and handed me another envelope. "This is not a payment," he said. "It is an offer." I opened it carefully. My breath caught. Then I looked back at him in complete disbelief. My hands trembled as I opened the envelope. Inside was not a check. Not a settlement agreement. Not a legal document. It was an employment offer. But not for my old position. This role was entirely different. Community Outreach Director for the Sterling Foundation. The salary alone made my eyes widen. Health benefits. Flexible hours. Resources to support charitable programs across the city. I looked up at Ethan, certain I had misunderstood something. "This cannot be serious." "It is." I read the title again. Then again. "I do not have experience for this." A small smile appeared on his face. "You have exactly the experience I am looking for." I shook my head. "Ethan, I cleaned guest rooms. And you helped employees without being asked. You spent your lunch break solving problems that were not yours. You treated people with dignity regardless of who they were. That is leadership, Grace. Most people just call it something else." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The autumn breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the park. Children laughed near the fountain. Life continued around us as though nothing extraordinary was happening. Yet my entire world was changing. "Why me?" I asked quietly. Ethan looked toward the skyline for several seconds before answering. Because somewhere along the way, I realized something. His voice softened. I built companies. Acquired buildings. Signed contracts worth millions of dollars. But the person who taught me the most about what matters was someone everyone else overlooked. Emotion tightened in my throat. I looked down at the offer letter again. For years, my life had been defined by survival. Paying bills. Working extra shifts. Worrying about tomorrow. I had never imagined being trusted with something bigger. Something meaningful. A week later, I accepted the position. The announcement surprised almost everyone. Some executives questioned the decision. Others quietly supported it. Ethan ignored the criticism and moved forward anyway. Over the following months, the foundation expanded programs for seniors, struggling families, and healthcare assistance initiatives throughout the city. For the first time, I was helping people on a scale I had never thought possible. And somehow, Ethan remained a constant presence through all of it. Sometimes it was a phone call asking about a project. Sometimes it was a meeting that turned into a long conversation. Sometimes it was simply two people sharing coffee after a difficult day. The friendship grew naturally. Slowly. Built on trust instead of promises. One spring evening, nearly a year after I had walked away from the estate carrying a cardboard box, Ethan and I stood overlooking the harbor from the same hill where everything had begun. The water reflected the colors of the sunset while sailboats drifted peacefully across the horizon. "Do you ever think about how close we came to never meeting?" he asked. I laughed softly. "We met long before you noticed me." He smiled at that. Then his expression turned thoughtful. "That is true." We stood in comfortable silence for a while. Finally, I looked out across the harbor and realized something. My life had changed in ways I never could have predicted. Not because someone rescued me. Not because luck suddenly appeared. But because truth eventually found its way into the light. Ethan once risked his reputation, his company, and the approval of powerful people to do what was right. And in the end, the greatest gift he gave me was not a job or an opportunity. It was proof that being invisible does not mean being worthless. Because sometimes the people the world overlooks are the very people who end up changing it.